How do you say this word?
I say Stella.
I say Stella, because I like to be able to then go, Stella!
Do you know that I don't know what movie reference that's from?
Steel.
The Carthaginian Empire, with its capital Carthage, now part of modern-day Tunis, was a major maritime and trading power from the 9th century BCE until its fall in 146 BCE. Carthage's wealth came from extensive trade networks and naval superiority, but it also clashed repeatedly with the Roman Republic in the Punic Wars. Society within the Carthaginian Empire was highly cosmopolitan, influenced by a blend of Phoenician, North African, and Mediterranean cultures. Religion played a significant role in Punic life, with devotion to deities like Baal-Hamon and Tenet often involving elaborate rituals and sometimes human sacrifices. But it's important that we note that most of what we know about the Carthaginian Empire comes from sources by its conquerors, the Romans.
So we are in the Bardo National History Museum in Tunis, Tunisia, and I want to talk about the founding of Carthage. Emily, what do you know about the founding of Carthage?
Nothing, literally, absolutely nothing.
Okay, so the stories that we have come from Greeks and Romans, and then oral traditions that were passed down through the Carthaginians. And there's like a little bit of overlap, but it's really shrouded in myth. And that is what I'm telling you. Just a little legacy. So, according to this legend, it was founded by Queen Elissa Dido in 814. And she is originally from Lebanon, so the Eastern Mediterranean region. And her brother, she's a princess, her brother was going to ascend to the throne, but Dido was married to a man that her brother Pygmalion ended up killing. Dido, fearing for her life and fearing for her safety, fled west across the Mediterranean and landed in modern-day Tunis, modern-day Carthage, and came across a Berber chieftain. Emily, heard of Berbers?
They're like indigenous nomadic groups across North Africa.
Yes. Came across this Berber chieftain, and Yarbo was like, you know what? I think you're beautiful. Whatever land that you cover with an ox hide, I will just cede over to you, and you can start this new colony. But Dido was very smart and very clever, and Dido decided to cut this ox hide into really long, thin strips, and then encircled the entire mountain of Mount Girsa, which is just like a hill that we can still see in the city today. And Yarbo was so impressed with her ingenuity that he said, yes, this can be your new settlement. You can freely settle here.
This is the sign of the Carthaginian kind of mother goddess Tenet, and one of the theories on how Tunis got its name is that it was somehow like a version of Tenet.
Talking about rating favorite gods, I would rate her 10 out of 10 it.
The city, it's looking more to the sea. The backs of the city is surrounded by walls. So here we have just one entrance from the commercial port.
This is the military port of Carthage, the circular part. And then on the top of the hill was where like the elites kind of controlled the city from. And then behind us over here, if you go over that way, was the commercial port. And the only entrance to the city was through that commercial port. Basically the city was surrounded by walls, and the only way you could get in was via that one commercial port. Kind of reminds us of Constantinople.
So, Carthage developed, obviously very close to the water, developed over time by the 400s BCE to the 200s BCE as this very dominant sea power. And it developed and emerged as one of my favorite words in history, which is a thalassocracy. You know what a thalassocracy is?
No.
It is a state whose power is derived by the sea.
Oh.
So Carthage ended up controlling much of the trade in the Mediterranean, and I mean, like, was genuinely one of the world superpowers at the time. And we don't often talk about it because it was defeated by Rome in the Punic Wars, and it fought against the Roman Republic in the Punic Wars because Rome was growing in power and influence and wanted to take down the other dominant power and take over control of the Mediterranean. Because if you control trade, you control wealth.
Does he have a lobster claw coming out of his head? It's the head of an ocean god.
That makes sense.
This was what the military port looked like during Carthaginian times, and they kept it all covered, like this was where their boats were, so that it was really difficult to spy. Like even to get in here, you had to get past the commercial port first. And the only way that the Romans were able to defeat the Carthaginians on the sea after 20 years was by stealing Carthaginian boats and then basically duplicating them.
So, Carthage was founded in 814 BCE, and it kind of, extended its power and influence a little bit in northern Africa, and then really reached its height around the 600s BCE. So then you see it take over more of North Africa. It's allying with a lot of Berber tribes. I really love this because this is from the 5th century, and this is from the 6th to 4th century, and they are Egyptian scarab beetles or Egyptian deities. So we even see, very extensive trade between Carthage and Egypt. And like I mentioned earlier, it becomes this thalassocracy, this state that's based on sea power. They were very incredible navy, and they set up colonies in Spain. We can still see effects of that today, in Sicily and with modern day Sardinia. And as it was growing in power and influence, really controlling trade, extraordinarily wealthy, Rome, at the same time, was also growing in power and influence in Italy. And they ended up getting into a series of conflicts called the Punic Wars, not the Pubic Wars, which is what our students love to call it.
And now for an incredibly brief overview of the Punic Wars.
Rome and Carthage clashed in the Punic Wars, which lasted from 264 to 146 BCE. Carthage was the dominant power in the Mediterranean, but Rome, growing in strength, wanted to conquer the island of Sicily, which was a valuable trading post controlled by the Carthaginians. In the First Punic War, Rome gained control over Sicily and forced Carthage to surrender, which marked the start of the Roman expansion beyond the Italian peninsula. The Second Punic War is the most famous of the Punic Wars, with Hannibal crossing the Alps with his war elephants, but ultimately ended where the Roman general Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal, leading to Carthage's surrender and the loss of its territories outside North Africa. The third and final Punic War was more about Rome ensuring that Carthage could never threaten it again. After years of rebuilding, Carthage had regained some of its strength, which alarmed Rome, and in response, Rome demanded Carthage's complete disarmament and eventual destruction. When Carthage resisted, Rome launched a brutal siege on the city. After a prolonged and bloody conflict, Rome captured and destroyed Carthage, razing the city and enslaving its population.
So here we have the port, here we have the sanctuary for sacrifice, human sacrifice, and Tophet, she was for farming, for production. So here we have the half moon. The half moon, the calendar for farming is with the cycle of the moon. All the rituals, according to the Roman, it was to venerate the power of Tophet.
A lot of what we know about human sacrifice within the Carthaginian Empire came from the Romans, and for a long time, historians believed that the Romans were creating this propaganda against Carthage in order to support the Punic Wars. Specifically, the writings that we have and the records that we have from the Roman Empire talk about Carthaginian practice of sacrificing children.
When you observe from outside all the symbols, the texts, what the Romans they did to taught us, you will be convinced that in some parts the Carthaginians, they are cruel people. They are killing their children.
This happened at a space called the Carthaginian Tophet and was motivation for a lot of Romans to get involved and subsequently lose their life in the Third Punic War.
But for the archaeologists, it was another way to think. But starting 17th, by the time they start to learn about what we have in the jars. And here it was the surprise. Maybe about 70-80% of the bones, teeth, what we have there, it was for animals.
So what's interesting is that during these archaeological excavations, people did find the remains of children. But what's really important to understand is that, one, there's no way to determine what age these children were when they were cremated. And of course, there's no way to determine how they died. And so the question is, why are the Romans assuming that these children were victims of human sacrifice when just as reasonably they could have been the cremated remains of children who died of various illnesses? There was a really high infant mortality rate. What's extra interesting is that the Romans discovered evidence similar to this in many other cities all around the Mediterranean, and yet the only city that they claimed was practicing child sacrifice on this scale was their enemy Carthage.
Maybe because the other cities, they were standing on the side of the Romans by the time of the war. So that's the political propaganda.
Because of the extent of the destruction by the Romans, there's not a lot of ruins left to see of ancient Carthage. But what we can see is really fascinating, and we're still learning more. When you visit Tunis, when you see really old things, they're mostly going to be things that were built by the Romans. But that's on the next episode.
And so when she, oh my gosh, sorry, don't stop. Okay.
So this is the sign of the goddess Tenet. It was basically the wife of their main kind of god of everything else. No, El Amut. You know his name? Are you still recording?